I have never seen so many people radicalized so quickly as I did the week following George Floyd's murder. It was a week I spent largely online, scrolling through Twitter, watching any live streams of protests that I could find. And it was a week in which I saw hundreds, no, thousands of people my age transform from establishment liberals into abolitionists in a matter of days. I had seen outrage before, of course, we all have, but this time it was different. This time, people on a mainstream level were starting to turn their anger towards the establishment itself. Obviously, abolitionists have existed for a very long time, but this was the first time I saw slogans like "abolish the police" going around what were previously pretty moderate circles. It was clear to me that this was a turning point for people not only in their political beliefs, but in the way they fundamentally view the world. This moment of racial reckoning does fall short if it does not include a re-examination of the way we think about punishment. With institutions such as the prison industrial complex, the police, and the school-to-prison pipeline wreaking havoc on marginalized communities every day, any conversation about anti-racism is incomplete if it does not include the careful consideration of our concept of justice. Oddly enough, I found the musical Les Miserables to be a useful framework to facilitate that internal dialogue in my own head. This musical is at its core an exercise in questioning what it means to be a criminal, what it means to be a prisoner, and what it means to be free. In this service, I'm going to discuss how the story of Les Miserables approaches these concepts and why these concepts are important to engage with in the first place. Les Mis is just an absolute powerhouse of storytelling. I can't begin to cover all of it because there's just so much there. And that's only the play. The book, which I have not read, is so huge that it's affectionately known among like online communities as the Brick, not the book. So yeah, I haven't read it, but I know the play pretty well. So the arc I'm going to focus on is that of Jean Valjean and his antagonist, Inspector Javert. Valjean is an ex-convict who fled parole to start a new life, and Javert is the policeman bent on bringing him to justice. These two are the swirling center of the narrative, and as we will come to see, their ongoing battle is emblematic of the show's primary moral conflict, the question of whether true rehabilitation is even possible, and whether mercy is justified in the place of a cold and unforgiving legal system. Actually, I don't think it's fair for me to call this the central moral conflict of the show, because as it turns out, we get an answer to this question not in a dramatic climax, but in the prologue. Les Mis, like most musicals, is split into two acts. Unlike most musicals, it follows its main character throughout his entire life. So the narrative spans over like decades and decades of canon material. The first act is Valjean as a relatively young man, as his child, or his adopted child, Cosette, comes into his care. The second act is Valjean in the second half of his life, with more narrative focus on Cosette as a teenager and the revolutionaries of her generation. It all begins, however, with a prologue that follows Valjean in the weeks after being put on parole. The story begins in prison, at the tail end of Valjean's 20 years in brutal conditions of forced labor. We learn quickly that his crime was that he stole a loaf of bread to feed a young family member. Inspector Javert pulls him aside in the opening lines and tells him that his parole has begun. "Do you know what that means?" he asks Valjean, or as we know him thus far, prisoner 24601. Valjean answers, "Yes, it means I'm free," to which Javert responds, "No, it means you get your yellow ticket of leave." And he's right, as we come to see through the prologue. Though Valjean is no longer imprisoned, he is not a free man. The aforementioned yellow ticket keeps him from getting a job, food, housing at an inn, anything that would help him transcend the conditions that led him to steal that loaf of bread in the first place. Instead, we see Valjean back on the streets, where he is found by a bishop who shows him mercy, giving him food and shelter for the night. In a moment of impulsive desperation, Valjean breaks into the bishop's cabinets in the middle of the night and leaves with as much silver as he can carry. He is caught by the authorities and brought back to the bishop in the morning, but the bishop shows him mercy once more by telling the police that the silver was a gift from him. Before Valjean leaves, the bishop tells him that he is beloved by God and that he should use the silver to become an honest man. Valjean escapes, and now alone, he has a major moment of crisis documented in the song, "What Have I Done?" which ends with him realizing that there is no way to go on as himself. In his arrest, they, to quote the song, gave him a number and murdered Valjean. After 20 years of dehumanization, to be shown mercy was incompatible with the world and his identity as he had come to know it. The solution, in his eyes, was to bring on a new and honest life, was to begin anew, essentially. And as the final chords of the prologue ring out, he tears up his yellow parole slip. The next time we see him, he is unrecognizable. He runs a factory, he's a mayor of the town, and he is healthy and he is rich. I have always found this story arc at the beginning of the play to be really politically interesting. Though him stealing from the bishop is framed as in part a moral failure on his part, it is also evident at every turn that there are a lot of forces at work here. Valjean, the criminal, is just a man. Law enforcement, however, refuses to see him as one, assigning him a number, insisting that he can never change and that his sentence is both righteous and deserved. And then there's the sentence itself. Yes, 20 years for a loaf of bread is an extraordinarily long time, but it's also made abundantly clear to the audience that in many ways his sentence was actually lifelong. As long as he had that yellow slip of paper, a normal life was impossible. Poverty, as it turned out, was just another type of prison to him and to every ex-convict. And it would drive him to commit the very same crime that landed him in jail in the first place, theft. Valjean did not pull himself up by his own bootstraps. He is only able to transform because of an extraordinary act of kindness, the gift of capital when he did nothing to deserve it. He is forgiven, and this is what propels him forward. At this point in the story, Valjean's character arc is weirdly actually kind of complete. The rest of the play is spent trying to live up to this promise of honor that he already made at the beginning of the show. So he doesn't really change all that much as he tries to live up to the promise he has already made. In terms of character development, though, this is his big transformation, one that the rest of the play works to support. So that's Valjean. Before pivoting to Inspector Javert, I think it's necessary to talk about how the world of Les Mis works in general. So Les Mis plays out similarly to myths and fables in that the story feels very aware of its status as fiction. It is not interested in realism so much as other methods of finding poignancy. For example, in a Greek myth, there's this sense that the characters you meet aren't really people. They're not characters. They're ideas that express themselves through the form of a character. Hercules, for example, doesn't exist to make us feel like we know him in the way that some characters nowadays may act. Like if you watch a sitcom, it feels like a character exists so that you can get to know them well and understand them. That is not often the case with like things like fables and myths. Instead, Hercules doesn't he doesn't exist to make us feel like we know him. He exists as a stand-in for a set of ideas that the world can then interact with. The world feels alive as much of a character as anyone else, and eager to pass judgment on characters and their essences. Or think about Aesop's fables, many of which are centered around characters with harmful essences getting their comeuppance. The hare is not a hare, but an expression of hastiness and hubris. The tortoise is not a tortoise, but a stand-in for quiet persistence and consistency. The world in which they exist is not a world meant to reflect our own, but a universe that rewards certain characters and their essences while condemning others. And it does. The tortoise wins and the hare loses. The story condemns one outlook on life and life in competition and rewards another. To a certain extent, Les Mis kind of works in the same way. Sure, we feel like we know Eponine, and that certainly strengthens the story, but she also has a really distinct character purpose. Everyone in this show does. Most people in this show have this sort of main idea that can be boiled down to a single statement. Enjolras wants a just society by any means necessary. Gavroche wants to be a hero and to stop being underestimated by those around him. Eponine wants Marius, but really she just wants the companionship of one she loves. Fantine wants a safe and happy life for her child. And so we know that these essences matter because of the way they are framed within the story. And one really important framing device for that is the mechanism of death in Les Mis. So there's a lot of death in Les Mis. I could count the characters that survive on the show probably on one hand. This makes for a very famously teary viewing experience, sure, but it also lends a lot of moral weight to the story structure. Every character who dies as a sacrifice. Every character's death is the purest possible expression of that character's essence. They all die for something. The world of Les Mis rewards those with strong convictions with a death that makes sense for them, that somehow fulfills that character's purpose. Enjolras dies on the barricade in one final show of his devotion to the cause. Eponine dies in Marius's arms. Fantine dies after working herself to the brink to protect Cosette, and is told in her last moments that her child will be cared for. And then we have Inspector Javert. So I've been talking about how each character has an essence. Javert's is by far the strongest one, because Javert is a stand-in for the law itself. Throughout the show, Javert's outlook on life really doesn't change. He has very little character development. Instead, it just exists, and then towards the end of the show, he has this crisis, and it falls apart all at once. So what is this outlook? Well, he tells us in the song Stars, which is Javert's tell-all number, his version of Who Am I? If any of you have been streaming Hamilton recently, which I'm sure some of you have, think of Stars as the Les Mis equivalent of Wait for It, a quiet statement of our complicated villain's outlook on life. In Stars, Javert sings of his devotion to capturing Valjean, which he sees as the truest possible expression of law and order. He describes the stars as sentinels, passive observers who watch over the earth, objective and true. In his words, they fill the darkness with order and light. They keep watch in the night, much like a policeman. This is what he considers to be his role in life, to bring order and objectivity to the chaos of the world, and to do so through the unquestioned good that is the law. As we learn later during the number confrontation, Javert was raised in a jail. The law is all he has ever known, and it has been his only source of moral guidance in life. Crucially, he considers redemption to be a genuine impossibility for criminals. Men like you can never change is a line he repeats so much to Valjean throughout the show that it's given its own musical theme. It sounds the same every time because it happens so often that it's just useful to have a musical shorthand for it. He is rigidly and persistently devoted to his version of justice, but it is one that does not include rehabilitation or forgiveness in any sense. So, back to death in Les Mis. I knew Javert was going, spoilers, by the way, I knew Javert was going to die by suicide before even listening to the show, because there's a song literally called Javert's Suicide, and I saw it on the back of a CD. So, I assumed, knowing the bare bones of the plot, that the suicide would probably be brought on by shame. Like he would have this come to Jesus moment where he would realize that, oh, I've been acting wrong this entire time. The only way to go forward is to take my own life. That's what I assumed was going to happen. That is not what happens. What actually happens, much to the delight of my argument, is that Valjean spares Javert's life, just as the bishop did for him all those years ago. And as a result, Javert freaks out about this moral power imbalance he now has to live with. He now has to live in the debt of a man who he always thought of as unredeemable. He cannot be indebted to a criminal. It would have been right. It would have made moral sense for Valjean to have killed Javert in Javert's eyes. It is what Javert would have done. But now he has to ask all of these questions about his entire worldview. The next few lines of the song, Javert's Suicide, are devoted to the question, can this man's sins/crimes be forgiven? And that's a question whose answer Javert has spent the entire musical asserting with his entire being, no, there should be no second chances. There is only what is right and what is wrong. But that to Javert is synonymous to what is legal and what is illegal. All of these are not just beliefs, they are personhood defining convictions. Javert has always been the law. In this song, he literally says, "I am the law." That's a line in the song. But that's not what he dies for here. He doesn't stake his life like the other characters. He dies because the minutes or hours he spent living in moral debt to Jean Valjean were simply too much to bear. He doesn't stake his life, he implodes, either at the thought that his convictions may have been wrong or at the thought of living in debt to someone he thinks of as the scum of the earth. This is his reaction to being morally indebted to a criminal who showed him kindness, which is interesting because it mirrors both musically and lyrically what happened in the beginning with Valjean and the Bishop. It's the same tune that they share when they say, I forget what they say. I think what they say is, "I'll escape now from this world, from the world of Jean Valjean." It's identical. So they're both of them are a suicide of sorts, but Javert's is an actual escape from the world, where Valjean's is simply a transformation in order to become a better man. So there's a lot different in those two, but they do mirror each other. So there's a lot going on with this dynamic of Javert versus Valjean. They are classic foils of one another, Javert being a stand-in for an unforgiving outlook and Valjean being a stand-in for the merit of a forgiving outlook. Now, in America, there's this idea of law and order, of an unflinching, not necessarily unforgiving, but an unflinching legal structure, which we have to abide by, or there's really no hope of redemption. And there are people working against that, and there always have been. But what Les Mis tells us is that these two ideas do actually contradict. Either people can change or they cannot. So I found in the last few months that when I thought about punishment, there was this mental resistance that I had when encountering especially radical ideas that would seek to challenge the establishment that I had grown up with. You know, I was a little bit too comfortable, I think, just taking everything for granted and not necessarily starting to question the establishment if I thought it was something that could be a detriment to our society. And that mental resistance wasn't something I was really conscious of until I started listening to it. And I don't know, it was a pretty funky journey to go on in my own head to try to undo all of these ideas that we all have grown up around. That if you are a criminal, you are somehow tainted for life. That if you have broken the law and end up in jail, maybe some people think you don't deserve to vote, or maybe some people think the sentences should be lifelong. There's a lot of complicated ideas wrapped up in this subject of prison and justice. But what I found useful was that theater as a medium is all about suspending disbelief. In sitting down to watch a play, we enter this sort of social contract. We agree to understand that even though we see that character miming that they're holding a teapot, we're agreeing to understand that it stands as a teapot in the show. We see the stage, but we're agreeing to understand that the stage is not what matters. What matters is the players on the stage. There's a lot of mental leaps that we have to get to that we have to go through in order to really immerse ourselves in a theater experience. That's one reason why I've always really, really loved it. It's not really that way in film quite as much because you're not really there. So there's less mental barriers that you have to push past in order to be immersed in something. But I find that those barriers can be really useful because suspending disbelief is a really useful tool to have just in your back pocket in terms of critical thinking. So, when you hear protesters call for a version of justice that includes radical change to the systemic status quo, I urge you to take a moment to try to suspend your disbelief. Take a moment not only to hear the people sing, but to understand what they are saying and why. If we can suspend our disbelief during the show of Les Mis, enough to understand Valjean, the force of forgiveness and kindness in his world, to be the unquestioned victor in the face of an unforgiving establishment, then perhaps we can find some way to apply that emotional logic to our world. And at this point in our world, I think it is more critical than ever to think critically about things that have always just been here, to question the establishment, not for the sake of questioning the establishment, but because it is work that's inherent to this anti-racism and social justice work. A lot of it is undoing what you already know or what you already feel because of the society we've been brought up in. So that's why I found Les Mis useful, was that I could enter this space in which I understood this central conflict between forgiveness and lack thereof, to have one correct answer, and for that answer to be forgiveness. And the suspension of disbelief was able to take me there. And then I could apply that logic to the real world if I needed to. And it was a useful way to open that conversation in my own head. So yeah, if we can suspend our disbelief long enough to understand Valjean to be the moral victor in this situation, maybe we can suspend our disbelief long enough to understand why people are calling for anti-establishment reforms or changes. And I think the world really needs that right now. So may it be, amen.